Hey taxonomists, we're going to be talking about kind of different ranks today. How do we decide what rank a new taxon gets, and some other things. Wanted to first start off by saying that ranking is kind of part of the process of classification. So when, say, someone comes up with a new species, someone finds a new species, or they're renovating an old publication, they're going to be deciding things like, is this an acceptable group? What rank does it deserve? And then what name should we give it? That's how you kind of classify something. So we've already been talking all semester long about how to group something. This is just simply figuring out whether or not something is monophyletic, right? So it's a simple answer. Is it yes or no? Like, is this a monophyletic group? No, it is not. Oops. But say, is this a monophyletic group? Yes. So that's what I mean by grouping. We just need to make sure that it is a monophyletic group that we want to apply a rank to. This is a figure that shows similarity space between different organisms. So where there's overlap, there's kind of similar features there. And notice that they're all at some point overlapping with each other, but they're not all necessarily touching, right? And so when we've got these kind of different traits that are overlapping in many ways, but not always, well, how do we know if that's kind of different enough to be considered a different subspecies? Or is it so different that it needs to be considered a different species? What biologists notice is that a lot of species are very closely related to each other, while there are other species that are very distantly related to each other. So how many differences does it take to make a new species, one might ask? This is where we're going in this conversation, which will last multiple lectures. So say if we decide we want to give this monophyletic group, we wanted to name this thing. Well, before we name it, we need to decide what ranking will we give this. Is this a genus with two species inside of it? Or is this a family with two genera? Is this a species with two subspecies? We need to know what rank to give. And in order to do that, we need to know kind of the relative names of the close relatives. We need to know, well, what are the other rankings of these nearby named taxa? And what ends up happening is sometimes other names in a new cladogram have to be changed. Maybe this is the family, maybe this is a family, or maybe this is the family, or maybe we want a kind of more inclusive family. That's what we're talking about when we're deciding rank. And I know we've talked about lumping versus splitting in the past when we were talking about the kind of Liliaceae explosion, if you will, that happened in the Jepson Manual 2. That was back from lectures probably around 10 and 11, I think. We talked about how if you lump things, so say maybe we want to make a really inclusive genus. Maybe we want to make a really inclusive genus and lump all of these species into one big genus. Well, some pros of that, some advantages to that would be... Well, some advantages to that might be that you have like kind of a more inclusive individual, and maybe we can keep the name. We don't have to change any names. But some downsides to that might be now that you have less predictive power. Well, the other option, if you don't lump them, is maybe you could split it. Oh, here's a genus, and then here's a genus, and there's 4 genera instead. So that would be kind of splitting them up. Now we would need to name each individual one, but each individual genus here would have more predictive power. There would be less individuals within that genus. And so we could really kind of describe it more in a more detailed way. Okay. Remember when we talked about the situation of the cupressus and the juniperus and our hesperocyperus? We talked about that for quite a while earlier in the semester, actually. This is the exact same cladogram, just in a slightly different form. We have Eastern Hemisphere cupressus and Western Hemisphere cupressus. That's what those stand for. Remember that what they found out based on DNA evidence is that these two different groups of taxa that we had been calling cupressus were actually not that close of relatives. And in fact, Juniperus was more closely related to our Western Hemisphere cupressus than our Western Hemisphere cupressus was to the other things that were being called cupressus over in the Eastern Hemisphere. And we knew that that was a problem. We knew something had to be done. But now my question to you is, which approach here is acceptable, or which approaches are acceptable? There are multiple that work. Could we lump these three into one genus? In theory, yeah, we could, because we're deciding the group is monophyletic, right? Here is the most recent common ancestor of those three. We're not leaving out any descendants. And so the one genus plan, it actually does work. What about the two genus plan? What if we wanted to group Juniperus with the Western Hemisphere cupressus group and then leave Eastern Hemisphere cupressus on its own? Would that work? Would that result in a modern day taxonomist accepting these two new groups? Yes, it would, because Eastern Hemisphere cupressus is a single element. It works on its own. You can either be one of two things if you're getting a name in 2020 as a modern taxonomist. You're either a single element like that, or you're a monophyletic group. And that's what this other group is here, the Juniperus and Western Hemisphere cupressus. That's a monophyletic group. And so the two genus plan works. At least that two genus plan works. This next one in line is grouping the Eastern Hemisphere cupressus with Western Hemisphere cupressus, and then it's leaving Juniperus out. So in other words, it's going like this. It's grouping Eastern Hemisphere and Western Hemisphere cupressus together, and then Juniperus on its own. Those would be the two groups. You can tell from this picture that that absolutely does not work. We can't group these two together if we're leaving out a descendant of their most recent common ancestor. And again, this is the most recent common ancestor shared between the two cupressus groups. We're leaving out Juniperus, and we can't do that. And so this third approach is not acceptable. The last approach, though, the three genus plan, totally. Yeah, we could have just split all three of them apart. And in fact, that's what happened. And this is how the story goes. Our Western Hemisphere cupressus, which 10 years ago in plant taxonomy, people had to learn Hesperocyparis as cupressus. Now we know this genus as a new name, Hesperocyparis. Remember that? All right. Next slide. I guess I have some questions for you. When I tell you that you've got a family, here's a family of Ranunculaceae. Here's another family. Oh, the Brassicaceae. How can we define the word family in both of those instances? And I'm not talking about defining Brassicaceae or defining Ranunculaceae. We can do that all day. Brassicaceae, they've got calyx and silicles and racemes and four-parted flowers and two short stamens with four. That's defining the family Brassicaceae. I'm talking about trying to define the word family. Do they all have the same number of species? Well, no, they don't. Think about Asteraceae. The massive number of species, 22,000 species. There are plenty of other families out there who have under a dozen species in the entire family. Same with the genus thing here. It's not like all families have the same number of genera. That's not how we're deciding that this thing is a family, as opposed to this thing being a phylum. They don't have the same number of genera. Do families all have the same geographical extent? Also, we'll just call everything in North America, this will be the family, and if they're found in a different continent, even if they're close relatives, then we'll call it. No. The geographical extent has nothing to do with how we are defining a family. Some families have species that are found all around the globe. Other families have species that are found in only one very small place in the world. Just in the tropics, or just in one little area of the tropics. Okay. What about when we're keying something out to get to a family? Do we use the same characters to get to genus? Right? Are we always talking about the position of the ovary? No, that does not always come up in the key. Does the number of petals always come up in the key? It actually doesn't either. What about the types of habit? No, you don't end up using the exact same characters to key members of a family. Okay, the last one here. Do they have the same degree of uniformity? Do they have the same ability, ease of recognition? So do you have the same ability of recognizing this family as you do that family? No, again, no. For example, Asteraceae again. Arguably one of the most easily recognizable families especially in our class that we pick up, because of those really distinctive filaries on the outside and those many tiny flowers. But then there are other members of other families that look drastically different from one another, that you would be kind of surprised to put into the exact same family. A classic example of that is the Fabaceae, which we're picking up next in lab, the legume family. No, we don't have the same degree of uniformity, is my point. Now, the truth is that experienced taxonomists, they know that the threshold of differences that marks species boundaries varies, both within and among genera. Hence, no one has produced a rule of thumb that can be applied all the way across the board. In other words, the word family is indefinable. We can't set a perfect definition for this word. We can define families, but there's no definition for the word family. This even goes when we look at DNA. It's not like all families have the exact degree of difference in their DNA. No, some families are more different than other families in their DNA. My point is that family, that word family, it is undefinable. And now my last question that I'll pose to you and leave as a cliffhanger. Is the word species different? Is the species rank problem different than the family rank problem? Well, we're going to talk about that in our next lecture. See you all next time.